The chosen topic for the talk today is one that I think will hopefully inspire conversation and perhaps upset a few people in the call. But the topic is what the right gets wrong. Now, I think it would be fair to say that at the moment there is a sense among the grassroots of the British right that something has gone wrong. Indeed, at a time when the British Conservative Party is enjoying an 80-seat majority, it seems content to continue with a certifiably unconservative agenda. In the previous calendar year, for instance, we have seen the British government deny the freedom of religion in preventing parents from withdrawing their children from sex education classes, preside over an unprecedented rise in immigration, both legal and illegal, endorse and in some places extend a radical Marxist programme of unconscious bias training, parrot the World Economic Forum's sinister Build Back Better slogan, and so on. And none of this is to mention the mishandling of the coronavirus crisis. Now, I do think the Conservative Party has lost its way, as have the right in general, but my concerns go somewhat deeper than just policy. In fact, I think it is the philosophy of the British right that I believe has been misappropriated and turned into an unrecognisable project that allows such misguided policies to be promulgated by the very party who ought to be alarmed at such developments. What is most frustrating is these mistakes and misunderstandings are so near the truth that they are often thought to be the real identity of British conservatism and the right in general. But all lies are wrapped in truth, and so we must, at the beginning of a new year, disentangle the lies from the truth and help to return the right to its roots. Before I begin, however, what I want to make clear is that I do not think these problems are necessarily limited to the right. In fact, if what I say is true, then I think these problems are endemic to the British political scene. In fact, I think you can even go further. These are not even problems that have grown from the principles of conservatism itself, but are instead an ideological project that has twisted the tradition of conservatism away from its roots and in the direction of a false neoliberal caricature of the world. So on that note, I think I can begin to explain what I mean. There is, at present, an inability to understand the conservative tradition because we attempt to do so through the paradigm of liberalism. This involves an uncritical acceptance of liberal principles as our baseline, our solid ground as it were, from which to venture out and attempt to understand other philosophies. As a result, we can never truly be conservatives because we have conceded the point at the outset. We are attempting to liberalise conservatism rather than retrieve the principles as they ought to be correctly understood. One example, posterior to those I want to explore fully below, is that of rights. We might hear quite frequently that the conservative defends the right to free speech or the right to privacy or, most significantly, the right to private property. In so doing, we forget that rights themselves are a language of the liberal and make little sense to the conservative. Rights, as with all liberal philosophical beliefs, are universal and abstract, relevant in all times and places, and this is anathema to the conservative vision of civil liberties and privileges. When we ask, for instance, what is the conservative vision of rights, we might as well be asking, how liberal can we make conservatism? Now, there's nothing inherently wrong in asking how liberal principles can be made accommodating to the traditions and customs of a people, but the problem I find with this is it speaks the language of a different philosophy. And when the language is dictated by something else, so too will be the terms of discussion. But as I say, this is a product of the problem I wish to discuss and not the cause itself. And we must not confuse the symptoms with the disease. In this, I think we can identify the principal problems of what the right gets wrong, or more accurately, where the right has gone wrong. And we can begin, I think, with the principle of individualism. It is the axiomatic language of liberalism to talk of the rights of the individual as the fundamental unit of society. There are a number of issues I think are wrong with this, mostly over points of confusion. For instance, the self is without doubt the fundamental unit of metaphysical experience, but that is to confuse man's existential nature with his social character. As I say, however, there is a certain truth that lurks behind the lie, so we must be careful to distinguish these two. As it stands, I do not think it is difficult to see the right's commitment to individualism. It was one of Margaret Thatcher's enduring comments that there is no such thing as society, there are only individuals, families, and the communities they build. The second part of that quote is extremely important, to which we'll return, but since then, the right has adopted an almost unequivocal attachment to the principle that the individual knows what is best for himself. The political historian Ewan Green, for instance, commented that Thatcher's beliefs surrounding individualism were not made by a politician who saw individualism as an adjacent concept. Rather, they implied a philosophy that emphasised a polity that was an aggregate of individual citizens, and which individual rights and duties were the fulcrum of social and political life. Since the days of Thatcher, the right in Britain has continually allowed the logical extension of the belief in individualism to its conclusion. Consider, for instance, the current debates on drug legalisation. They are almost always predicated on the idea of victimless crimes, as if the self can never be the victim of the self. The underpinning philosophy is one of individual choice, as if the individual ought never be constrained in choice, especially by government. We can see similar developments, especially in the last year, in the realm of pornography and the rise of OnlyFans. The assumption lying behind the freedom of young women, and it is almost always young women, to show off their bodies on the internet, is that it is entirely their choice and can therefore only be an act that they and no one else can decide on. This is not a problem relegated only to the right. Indeed, it seems to have affected much of our political discourse, but the principle the right uses to justify it is individualism. Whereas the left might use terms such as liberation or expression, the individualistic right asserts that it is absolute freedom of choice that must be privileged. The political philosopher Michael Sandel has written extensively on this topic, and his book Democracy's Discontent is probably the best work that I can find that summarises this. Sandel makes it very clear that the problem lies in what he calls the unencumbered self, a Kantian liberal view of the individual that precedes society. I think we can also call this the rational autonomous actor. The internal makeup of this concept is complicated, but there are some key points to it that we can identify. First, the idea is that the individual is separate from and separable from society. What this means is that in the liberal understanding, the individual is a self-contained being, existing prior to any setting in which he finds himself, and therefore free of any duties or responsibilities save those he chooses. To quote Sandel, conceived as unencumbered selves, we must respect the dignity of persons, but beyond this, we owe only what we agree to owe. Liberal justice requires that we respect people's rights as defined by the neutral framework, not that we advance their good. Whether we must concern ourselves with other people's good depends on whether, and with whom, and on what terms we have agreed to do so. Under the principles of individualism, each person is capable of choosing the methods by which he attains the good life, if indeed he chooses to at all. In presuming this, the individualism also works on the basis that the individual retains the relevant knowledge capable of achieving the ends he chooses. In other words, he has what can be called perfectly appropriate knowledge. Now, this is not the same as perfect knowledge, but knowledge that is both necessary and complete in a given circumstance. This knowledge stems from the separability concept. If the individual can be taken as distinct from any circumstance that he finds himself in, then his capacity to know and choose his own ends must also be distinct from that circumstance. This is because, liberalism asserts, to assign knowledge to a given circumstance is to presume that the knowledge is only generated in that circumstance and not inherent to the individual. Now, some knowledge is not inherent, but only available to the individual. For instance, his hunger or his mood, or any similar interior circumstance that only the individual has access to. Taking hunger as the example, we have to ask, how does he know what to eat? Under the liberal framework, we are still presuming, of course, that he is distinct from any circumstance, and that his knowledge is inherent to himself and intimately connected to his desires. But therefore we have to ask the question, how can he know what is consumable? If the liberal framework is to be truly consistent to the rational autonomous actor, then he must know prior to the circumstance in which he finds himself what he can eat. In other words, he knows exactly what to eat and, more importantly, what not to eat. Now, personally, I think this is absurd. No person is dropped fully formed onto the earth in possession of knowledge that allows him the capacity to act in whatever circumstance he finds himself. But I'll come back to this in a moment. Coming back to the liberal presumption of the rationally autonomous actor, the logical consequence of the two former concepts, separability and perfectly appropriate knowledge, is the synthesis of the two in autonomous agency. This synthesis means simply that the individual is capable of doing that which is necessary for the satisfaction of his wants and desires, and any inability to do so is obstruction. The interpretation of this synthesis has divided liberals greatly. Some take it to mean that the natural limits of law are to respect individual agency as much as possible, while some take it to mean that the law ought to assist the individual in order to respect his agency. These two approaches are, in rather simple terms, the negative and the positive conceptions of freedom, respectively. But this is where I think we need to clarify things. This to me is a misunderstanding of the individual, and least of all because it takes a caricature of human action and elevates it to the level of principle. What we really ought to understand when we talk of the individual is of what I think we can call the rooted person. In distinction to the liberal, rational, autonomous actor, the rooted person as a concept is founded on the understanding that no person is complete in the abstract, and only can be recognised as who they are by virtue of their circumstance. This begins from a recognition that what we call a person is someone who has to grow and is not born. This is founded on the extremely simple anthropological fact that despite what Rousseau might have claimed, we are not born free, but rather we become free through growing from a helpless and vulnerable infant to a physically capable but mentally unformed adolescent to a hopefully mature adult. The truth, therefore, that lies at the heart of the liberal misunderstanding of the individual is that he is the agent of the will, but he only has a capacity to act in the circumstances that provide that capacity. So, I'll break down what I mean here. First, we need to understand that an individual is born but a person is made. To this end, an individual becomes a person as a part of his active involvement and passive internalisation of the wider society in which he grows. This is often referred to as the organic conception of society because it recognises that society is not an aggregation of individuals, but a body in itself, of which each member is a part that grows in accordance with the health of the whole and contributes to that health with his own life and experience. This is not a controlling vision of the world, but rather one that endows the person with the freedom that liberals so crave. We emerge into the world utterly helpless, and through the love and guidance of our parents, and the tutelage of the living society, and the bank of refined knowledge that is our inheritance, we become able to navigate the world and understand our own experiences. What is more, this experience is what allows us to in turn contribute to the vast bank and capital of nations and ages, as Edmund Burke said, through simple experimentation and shared understanding. This reveals to us the epistemic limits to the liberal understanding of the individual. Indeed, prior to an event or experience, all we can know in ourselves is the desires and emotive responses that are the inherent elements of the knowledge I mentioned above. The individual at such a moment is presented with an option. He can recklessly charge in and risk the worst possible outcome, or he can consult the social knowledge that has been gathered across generations as a tool for navigating such an event. Of course, there is always the possibility that what we may face is entirely novel and unique, no matter how distant that possibility might be. But the intimations of knowledge gleaned from other experiences will always be a finer guide to action than a tabula rasa. From this, I think we can finally see the truth of our individual lives with regards to action. It is not autonomous, with any restriction a product of coercion and constraint, but it is situated and guided, empowered by the assistance and wisdom of ages. This is what I believe we can call situated agency. It is a recognition that, as I say, the individual is the agent of the will and capable of decision making, but he does so in a circumstance that constrains his action with reference to knowledge and a society that aids his decision making. This is not to deny that he might do otherwise. Indeed, he might choose to disregard that wisdom, and that is his prerogative, but even that capacity to decide to do otherwise is because he has had his mental faculties aided and nourished by the very knowledge he might choose to repudiate. So much for individualism. But how can we undo this atomization? And indeed the question needs to be asked, can we? It is undeniable that individual rights and the project of the Enlightenment recognised important limits to government action and provided what Roger Scruton called a sphere of protection around the individual's legal existence. But I think in many ways this project threw the baby out with the bathwater. John Stuart Mill's paradigmatic harm principle, for instance, holds a great degree of power in the context of law and politics, but he himself was fearful of its implementation in the social sphere. It is not that surprising when one considers he wrote of the need to guide and protect those, both individuals and civilizations, too mentally unformed to live their own lives. If there is a counterweight that can be used to level out the scales once again, I think it is the emphasis on duty and responsibilities that must accompany the rights and freedoms of liberal individualism. The freedom to speak, for instance, means very little without the corresponding duty to speak well. But while the freedom of speech comes from a metaphysical truth of our privileged capacity to speak, and that freedom ought to be enshrined in law, it is also our corresponding duty to use that speech well. The other possibility I see is a recognition, from the concept of the rooted person, of the origins and purposes of authority. This purpose is, quite simply, to protect us in our vulnerability, guide us in our education, and guard the knowledge we have gathered. In Scruton's words, to argue with John Stuart Mill that the function of the law is to guarantee the greatest liberty of the individual is to detach the law from its bedrock in moral consensus. What then of the origins of authority? As I say above, this is intimately connected to the question of the person and his relation to the society of which he is a part. Furthermore, if the liberal anthropology of the rationally autonomous individual is incorrect, then so too is the assumption that all laws only exist at the consent of the governed, especially if the governed extends beyond merely those living at any one moment to the generations that have come before and will come after. Authority instead is something much more natural and a product of that organicism that I have discussed above. Authority arises in the natural process of life as we recognise that limits to our action exist, as I say, to guide us and protect us. The finest institution through which we learn this is the family. It is to the family that we owe the very possibility of our existence, and from that basic fact, realistically, we owe them everything. I will not pretend, however, that this is a one-way relationship. The Christian commandment, for instance, to honour thy mother and father is, after all, balanced by the duty that is incumbent on every parent to put their child's health and happiness first. This is a duty that can be abused and one that can be neglected, but that does not offend the duty's existence, merely reinforces it. And in understanding this fact, the child learns also where authority can transgress its limits and be wielded arbitrarily. In the same way, therefore, that we come into existence through the love of our parents and mature in their guidance, so too do we become persons through our participation in society at large. It is here, though, that I think we can address another misunderstanding by the contemporary right, and that is of its conception of the family. This particular conception that I wish to challenge here is the model of the nuclear family. As I say, however, all convincing lies are built on at least some truth, and we must be careful to dissect the two. In the mid-20th century, and in America especially, the idea that emerged of a particular family model was centred around mum, dad, and 2.5 kids. It was a product of a particular time and economic circumstance, but also one of rising standards of public health. As fewer children died before the age of 5, it became less common to have large families, and instead have smaller families that suited the mobility of American life, a mobility that became exacerbated in the 1980s, as Michael Walzer has thoroughly dissected. The right, I find, often defends this style of family as if it were the natural or correct model. What we tend to see, however, is that this model is specifically a family type that only belongs to the West, and more importantly, only to affluent parents. What it also reflects, in addition, is a certain atomism bred from the very individualism of liberal philosophy, in that it curiously omits one of our most valued relations, grandparents. As a result, it reduces the experience of family to absolute immediacy. I think it is little surprise that the age of the nuclear family coincided with the rise of the retirement home industry. When the poet W.H. Auden wrote in 1969, "In yesteryears it was different, the old could still be helpful when they could nicely envisage the future as a nameable settled landscape their children would make the same sense of as they did," he was conscious of the generational disconnect that had arisen as a result of both the rapid pace of life in the post-war period and the prescriptive model of the nuclear family. Of course, the old can still be helpful, but when their use is seen as ancillary to the requirements of the family, the wisdom they carry with them is devalued. The most significant problem, however, that follows the nuclear model of the family derives itself directly from the individualism I have discussed. This is, quite put, the contractual view of marriage and family in general. At a basic level, if the individual is endowed with the final authority on any obligations he might make, then he too is the authority on ending them. In this, marriage is seen as something from which he may leave at any moment, rather than the lifelong commitment it was always intended to be. Following the logic of individualism, marriage is something that two people join into for convenience and for nothing deeper. The reason for this comes from the contractual element that is inherent in individualism. If all forms of association are products entirely of unfettered choice, then there must be a self-regarding reason for entering into them. Now, I don't want to denigrate contracts here. The common law practice of contracts as a method of ensuring obligation was a masterful development, but contracts can only ever enforce temporary association. Indeed, that is their logic. If two individuals meet for the sake of a common goal that can be achieved, then they can also dissociate once that goal has been achieved, and the exit clause of contracts was intended to recognise this eventuality. Viewing marriage through a similar lens, however, is to ignore one key fact. There is no goal in marriage that can be achieved. Instead, marriage is the goal, and it is realised every day in the commitment each spouse makes to the other. Of course, the other problem that derives from such a view of marriage is it transforms it from a social institution to a political one, by introducing a political principle into the equation. What once was intended to shield the individual from the vicissitudes of majoritarian government becomes a mechanism by which the state can interfere with the entirely apolitical institution of marriage. It is no accident that we are witnessing the rise of no-fault divorce, introduced in this country by a supposedly conservative party, as the apotheosis of this view. After all, divorce can only have no fault if there was no obligation made in the first instance. What ought to be remembered is that marriage is inseparable from the family, as it is entered into entirely for the children who follow on, not for the parties prior to the act. In other words, you do not get married for yourself only. You get married to ensure the stability of your children's lives in order that they may grow into the persons I discussed above. If we privilege the individual's choice to the sacrosanct level of principle, then any who enter into marriage will inevitably see the intrinsic sacrifices made by each person as constraints on their behaviour, not as acts that create value in themselves. To do so is to risk the most important part of marriage, the flourishing of children, a duty of which there is no equal and no second chance. One area of life in which contracts are essential and valuable, as I've said, however, is the economy and the free market. This, save my final concern, is one area in which the right has gone so disastrously wrong that I believe there is little left to retrieve. Indeed, the so-called Conservative Party seems intent on sacrificing all institutions and valuable social life on the altar of global capitalism. As I've said, since the days of Margaret Thatcher, the Conservative Party has been the defender of free market capitalism and apparently the prevailing global neoliberal consensus. The 2017 general election manifesto, however, showed a desire to move away from this economic order to the more middle ground Toryism of the days of Harold Macmillan, as did the overtures made to the so-called Red Wall in the 2019 election. The question arises once again, therefore, why do Conservatives defend free market capitalism, and more importantly, when should they not? The first important step to take is away from the base superstructure fallacy of Marxism. To fix ourselves to a vision of society built on economic organisation is to play into the hands of Marxists who conceive of social relations as predicated on historical materialism, that the economic mode of relations determines how society is structured. The fact of the matter is the opposite. Capitalism is not an inherent truth of human nature, but an expression of the truth that knowledge is dispersed and diffuse, much in the same way that Friedrich Hayek argued that no central agency can plan a price mechanism. Kieran O'Hara refers to this concept in conservatism as the knowledge principle. Furthermore, to fix our view of politics to a permanent conception of economic relations is to ignore also the utilitarian misunderstanding of individuals' mental faculties. This relates, as I say, to the individualism of liberalism. But quite simply, we are not rational actors. The famous thought experiment of Buridan's donkey provides us with an example of why. A donkey stands between two bales of hay, perfectly identical, and the donkey is given by some miracle perfectly rational thought, yet he will not be able to decide between the two bales of hay, and will therefore starve to death. The truth of the human condition provided by this thought experiment is that while we have the capacity for rational thought, it is only following the satisfaction of basic desires that they can be known. Only with reference to past knowledge can they be exacted, and even then, emotional factors always influence our decisions, perhaps sometimes more than our rational faculties. This was what Edmund Burke meant when he said that prejudice, the vast bank of experience generated by society, was of ready application in the emergency. It is better to act according to tradition than not at all. Those who blindly follow the doctrine of Marxism and Marx's assumption of the base superstructure fallacy, even if they reject his conclusion of socialism's inevitability, and defend instead economic liberty as a method through which political and social liberty can be achieved, make it possible for socialism to become true. Since the 1980s, neoliberalism has run rampant across the Western world and torn down the social welfare systems of Great Britain and elsewhere, and was perceived quite correctly by Michel Foucault as the dawn of a new method of governance that altered the very way we deal with one another. Foucault's argument, developed further by Thomas Lemke, was that we would begin to make moral decisions in the same way we would make economic decisions, as cost-benefit actions that should only ever improve our own position. This notion of governmentality produced a new understanding of how the base superstructure fallacy could be true. If, after all, we make our decisions in an economic manner, and the economic manner is one of prevailing selfishness, then our moral order becomes one of selfishness too. From this, we must move away from the economic system to define our morality. The same is true in the opposite direction. Enoch Powell once argued that the parable of the Good Samaritan would mean nothing if there had been a Roman soldier forcing him to help the beggar. Instead, this is where the conservative attitude to government comes into play, which I discussed below. A free economy is the only sustainable method to deliver the funds needed to maintain a functioning military, welfare system, and all the luxuries that Western culture has developed, but it is only with a strong sense of community and local loyalty, which is what Burke referred to as prejudice, that the trust and principles upon which that free economy has developed in the first place can truly flourish. Here, the government of the day should do everything it can to promote the correct values and morality that will continue to allow the mechanism of the market to function. But the values can only ever be promoted, not enforced, otherwise the Good Samaritan is not good and is merely a citizen. In contrast to the conservative, reluctant capitalism, so to speak, the socialist view of economics and society aimed towards the rationalisation of national economies and takes a harder view of the role that the economic system must play. Socialism would attempt to fix commodity prices and wages in such a way that the economy would eradicate social injustices by removing wealth discrepancies that the economy has created. But the socialist misunderstanding of society's relation to economic order literally puts the cart before the horse. The Marxist-Leninists discovered this in 1921, when after eradicating private property and wealth discrepancies, or at least for some, as naturally the party was exempt, social inequalities persisted. The social engineering of socialists that demands the eradication of those in the way of the march to utopia recognises, even if those who implement it don't, that the social order must be altered first if the economy is to fall in line. This is why, as Michael Oakeshott argued, the rationalist agenda fundamentally destroys the knowledge base upon which it is founded. But as above, conservatives should avoid the permanent attachment to an economic order that would risk the primary organ of society, specifically civil society. In a House of Commons debate in 1947, for example, Lord Hailsham told the House that if you do not give the people social reform, they shall give you social revolution. Thereafter, the Conservative Party adopted the popular and populist Labour agenda of extending the arm of the state further in the direction of statism and dirigee strategies aimed at the alleviation of social struggle and the Beveridge Report's 5 evils. It was, after all, Harold Macmillan that delivered 2 million affordable homes. The reason, it was argued, was that the wealth inequalities were an issue not of justice, but of socio-practical concerns that were destroying the fabric of social life essential to maintain order, and therefore sustain the institutions that would allow for the development of life in a virtuous direction. Now, do we believe this to be the case today? Some conservatives would say yes, and some would say no, but some don't believe it matters. From my perspective, the pursuit of these socialist strategies must be separated from the socialist agenda. The sanctified ends of equality and utopianism, altars upon which the very fabric of social order we seek to protect will be sacrificed, should be rejected for the dogma that they are. And this is why conservatives ought to defend capitalism, not as a tool through which culture, society, and the individual can be shaped and controlled, but as an expression of the truth of society and the spontaneous association between persons. It is here, I think, and I'm sure you'll be relieved to hear, that I can turn to my final point. My concern is with the right's consistent desire to defend what it calls the small state. Indeed, in the last 40 years, two terms have been conflated in conservative philosophy: the concept of limited government and the political programme of a small state. The former is a traditional approach to governance that conservatives defend, in that it does not specify a particular restriction to government action, while the latter is an ideological goal that measures the validity of government action by how far it aligns with a preconceived notion of what a state should do. In another way of putting it, the term limited government is structural and concerned with the way government is built and constrained. Small state, however, is a substantial definition of the responsibilities of government and where those responsibilities end. The two are not incompatible, but the two are not destined to be fused together inseparably. So why does this matter? Well, because the conservative rhetoric has been confused by the conflation of these two terms. In the English tradition, limited government is a reflexive and elastic term that allowed government to expand, withdraw, intervene, shift its focus, and in all things remain limited. And I don't think I can stress that word enough. The use of the word limited is very much a constitutional phrase, that no matter how big the state should become, it remains constrained. In America, at the outset of the Republic, James Madison argued stringently that power could only check power, and the most efficient levers of constraint lay both in the separation of powers and the channeling of plural desires into the mechanisms of government that would allow them to weigh against one another. It is particularly revealing that the phrase separation of powers came from the Baron de Montesquieu in his observation of the beautiful efficiency of the English 18th century constitution. To fuse the two terms together is to make the conservative into a distinct form of neoliberal who sees any form of government action as authoritarian, or especially in the case of economics, even socialist, and appeal irrationally to the natural liberal impulse in all Britons for the state to be kept at arm's length. American philosopher George Will, in his book Statecraft as Soulcraft, made the very powerful argument that a state cannot retreat into itself, or society will, as Burke put it, collapse into the dust and powder of individualism. Indeed, one of Will's enduring arguments, in my mind, is the refutation that government can be thought to be neutral. It is something of a principle of liberalism that the state, governing over a pluralist society, ought to be neutral with regard to the countervailing interests that each plural group professes. This was in fact one of Madison's great beliefs. But Madison and the American founders were writing at the beginning of a new nation, one that had not yet confirmed a moral consensus on which law could be built, and so the government had to provide room for that consensus to emerge. In England, however, we have a deep well of history to draw from, and so this moral consensus is not so easily ignorable, however fashionable it might be to do so. Instead, we need to bear in mind Will's observation that all government action is to condemn or condone. Even inaction is a form of action, for when an evil runs rampant in your state, you are seen to favour it if you do not prevent it. The summary of these arguments, referenced briefly in the hopes that the listener will research them for himself, is that state action is necessary to avoid the collapse of society. While inequality is a natural state of affairs, it does not follow that inequality is desirable, especially where that inequality erodes the very foundations of political institutions, which largely exist to find a way of harmonious living despite practical differences. When Peter Dorey observed that the British Conservative Party was concerned with inequality, he made it very clear that the post-Second World War Conservatives were concerned with bounded inequality, while the Thatcherite paradigm was the exact opposite, as unbounded inequality. In short, a small state risks eroding the society over which it governs. Conservatives, therefore, ought to be wary of a small state, but they must also be wary of a too powerful one. It is not a philosophical principle, but rather a pragmatic axiom that the apparatus of government can be captured by the wrong ideas, although not necessarily the wrong people. John Locke famously wrote in his letter concerning toleration that the care of souls is not committed to the civil magistrate any more than to other men, nor can any such power be vested in the magistrate by the consent of the people, because no man can so far abandon the care of his own salvation as blindly to leave it in the choice of any other, to prescribe to him what faith or worship he shall embrace. Here, Locke's concern was that should the power to determine conscience or belief be one that the government possessed, then that power could be used by a conspiracy to enforce an alien belief onto the people over whom that government reigns. Some might find such a pronouncement preternatural. Conservatives might also tend towards an authoritarian mindset when they consider that the purpose of government is to protect the society that formed it, which necessarily involves the limitation of dangerous and harmful activities, such as the consumption of narcotics, or reckless driving, or so on and so forth, that are all selfish in such a way that they erode the bonds between persons, as I explained above. But the danger of authoritarianism is that it does not dissipate with the authoritarians. If conservatives construct a state in which they have the ability to punish people for aberrant thoughts or incorrect attitudes, then that state may one day be used to punish them. Consider, for instance, early 20th century Russia. After the October Revolution, the powerful Tsarist government was not deconstructed, despite strident attacks made by the Bolsheviks and Mensheviks towards it in the years preceding, but was utilised by the communists in order to silence dissent. Similarly, the new French Republic in 1790 and onwards was able to enforce its new project in philosophical politics only through the structure of French absolutism established in the preceding century, taken to absurd ends with the terror and the systematic execution of the aristocracy. Contrast this, instead, to the English state that so enamoured the Baron de Montesquieu in his visit in the early 18th century. England, recently politically joined with Scotland in the Act of Union, and declared a constitutional monarchy in 1688 following the Glorious Revolution, had developed a system that, as I say, Montesquieu termed the separation of powers in his text L'Esprit de Loi, and became a famous concept in political liberalism. Montesquieu was fearful of a powerful state that eroded long-standing liberties, considering Louis XIV, who died in 1715, had continually forced the regional parlement to accept royal decrees, despite their historical freedom to shape decrees in such a way that they respected the local customs. Montesquieu did not live to see the French Revolution, but one can imagine his horror at the fusion of all branches of government into a single monolith. This is why conservatives must align themselves with a structural political liberalism and put their faith in a social and institutionally autonomous conservatism that demands self-responsibility, self-governance, and self-discipline. By social conservatism, I do not mean a substantial connection to the ideals of yesteryear, but a belief in responsibility to balance the rights with which we have all been endowed. It might be your right to speak, but it is your responsibility to speak well. If the state becomes the single arbiter by which our behaviour can be considered appropriate or legitimate, it can also become the method by which behaviour can be controlled. And this is why conservatives must defend limited government, because almost certainly that government might be controlled by those with whom you disagree. To draw all of this to a close, what I hope to have shown here is two things. The first, as I say, is where the right has gone wrong in its public philosophy, and suggest some changes, however small, to find our way back. The second is that there is a coherent alternative to the prevailing liberal consensus, and it is one that is far older, predicated on appreciation for the wisdom of the past, a government that acts where it ought to for the public good, a market that expresses an underlying freedom and consensus, the true vision of family life, and most importantly, the proper understanding of the person. Thank you very much for listening.